My uncle changed the locks of the house I inherited. He begged me to take it back when he found out how much it cost to own it. My grandmother basically raised me after my parents died when I was 8, lived with her for 10 years until college, then visited every weekend after graduation. She always told me the house would be mine one day since I was the only grandkid who actually cared about her. My Uncle Paul only showed up when he needed money. My Aunt Lisa called maybe twice a year, but I was there every Sunday for dinner, drove her to doctor appointments, fixed things around the house. Grandma had this beautiful Victorian house worth about $800,000. She'd lived there 50 years and maintained it perfectly. Had these original hardwood floors and stained glass windows that were irreplaceable. She told everyone at every holiday dinner that the house was going to me. Paul would just roll his eyes and change the subject. Grandma passed away last month. At the funeral, Paul suddenly became the grieving son, crying louder than anyone, talking about how close they were. I knew she'd left me the house, so I wasn't worried about his performance. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. Paul didn't even wait that long. The day of the funeral, while everyone was still at the reception, Paul broke into Grandma's house and changed the locks. I found out when I went there that evening to water her plants like I always did. My key didn't work, and Paul answered the door in his bathrobe. Told me he was the eldest son, so the house was obviously his. Said I could schedule a time to get any personal items, but he was living there now. I called the lawyer immediately. He confirmed the will clearly stated the house was mine. Paul didn't care. Said possession was everything and I'd have to evict him, which would take months, maybe years. He was right about eviction taking forever. I looked into it, and with backlogged courts, could be 18 months minimum. But here's what Paul didn't know. Grandma had given me power of attorney 2 years ago when she had a minor stroke. She recovered fully, but never revoked it. I also had access to all her financial accounts as the joint holder. More importantly, I knew things about that house Paul didn't. Like how Grandma never updated the electrical panel from 1962. Or how the foundation had cracks she'd been monitoring for years. Or that the gorgeous copper pipes were one winter away from bursting. Paul had no idea about any of the house's quirks because he never helped with maintenance. So I started my plan. First, I canceled all the utility accounts that were still in Grandma's name. Power, water, gas, trash, everything. Told them the owner had passed and the estate was being settled. Paul had to set up new accounts, but utility companies required massive deposits since he had terrible credit. $800 just for electricity. Then I remembered Grandma's home insurance was auto-paid from her account, which I controlled. Canceled that too. Paul couldn't get insurance without proving ownership, which he couldn't do without the deed, which was in my name per the will. No insurance meant the mortgage company started sending scary letters. Oh yeah, Paul didn't know Grandma had reverse mortgaged the house 5 years ago to pay for her medical bills. That was another thing only I knew as her power of attorney. The reverse mortgage was due in full upon her death. Paul started getting letters demanding immediate payment of $300,000 or they'd foreclose. He called me panicking, but I said he wanted the house so bad he could figure it out. Next, I called every contractor in town and scheduled estimates for various repairs. Told them the new owner Paul would be handling everything. Foundation specialists, electricians, plumbers, roofers, everyone. They all showed up and told Paul about critical repairs needed. The foundation alone was $60,000. The electrical was a fire hazard that needed immediate rewiring for $30,000. The roof had maybe 6 months left. Paul was getting 20 calls a day from contractors following up on the emergency repairs. Then the city showed up. Turns out Grandma's house was in a historic district. Any changes needed special permits and approvals. Paul had started tearing out the old kitchen without permits. The stop work order came with daily fines of $500 until he fixed everything back to original condition. He couldn't afford authentic 1920s tiles and fixtures. The fines kept adding up. After 3 weeks, Paul called me sobbing. The mortgage company was starting foreclosure. The city fines were at $10,000. The house had no power because he couldn't afford the bill. Pipes had frozen and burst, flooding the basement. The contractor quotes totaled over $200,000 in necessary repairs. He begged me to take the house. I said I'd think about it. Let him sweat for another week while the situation got worse. The city condemned the property as uninhabitable due to the water damage and electrical hazards. Paul was living in a motel. Finally, I offered to take the house off his hands if he signed a statement acknowledging he'd stolen it from me initially and would pay me $50,000 in damages. Paul laughed right in my face. Said I was out of my mind if I thought he'd give me a single dollar after he already won by taking the house. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the frame. I stood there on the porch listening to him stomp around inside. Then his voice got louder. He was calling someone, probably his lawyer, and I could hear him through the door talking about my ridiculous demands. I walked back to my car feeling this weird mix of anger and satisfaction. He had no idea what was coming. Back at my apartment, I pulled out Grandma's old address book, the one with the cracked leather cover she'd kept for 40 years. Found Hattie Montgomery's name under the lawyer section. Grandma had used her for some property dispute years ago and always spoke highly of her. I called the number and got lucky when Hattie answered personally instead of some receptionist. Explained the whole situation while she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me to come to her office that afternoon with all my documentation. Hattie's office was in one of those old downtown buildings with creaky floors and tall windows. She was maybe 60 with gray hair pulled back tight and these sharp eyes that missed nothing. I spread out everything on her desk. The power of attorney paperwork. The joint account statements. The the will that clearly stated the house was mine, Paul's texts admitting he changed the locks. She went through each document carefully, making notes on a yellow legal pad. After 20 minutes, she looked up and smiled, told me we had multiple ways to make Paul's life extremely difficult until he gave up. Said the key was applying pressure from every possible direction at once so he couldn't catch his breath. I liked her immediately. Hattie filed an emergency motion for immediate possession the next morning, based everything on the will and Paul's illegal entry, but she warned me the court date wouldn't happen for at least 6 weeks because of the backlog. Said we should use that time to make Paul understand exactly what owning Grandma's house actually cost. She suggested coordinating a pressure campaign that would hit him from every angle. Legal, financial, municipal, everything. I told her to do whatever she thought would work. Gave her full authority to coordinate with the mortgage company, the city, anyone who could help squeeze Paul. She said she'd start making calls that afternoon. 3 days later, Paul got the formal foreclosure notice from the reverse mortgage company. 30 days to pay the full $300,000 or vacate the property. He called me at 7 in the morning screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Said I was trying to steal his inheritance and he'd sue me for everything I had. Told me I was a vindictive monster who couldn't stand that he'd outsmarted me. I waited until he ran out of steam, then reminded him very calmly that he stole my house first. Said if he wanted to play possession games, he could deal with the consequences. Hung up while he was still yelling threats. The insurance situation hit next. Victor Perkins called Paul about the lapsed homeowner's policy. I knew because Paul left me an angry voicemail about it. Victor had explained that without proof of ownership, Paul couldn't get coverage. That meant any damage to the house came entirely out of Paul's pocket. Paul tried using Grandma's old policy documents, but Victor told him those died with Grandma. The estate needed to establish new coverage, which required the actual heir's signature. My signature. Paul called me begging to sign the insurance paperwork. Said it was just basic protection for the house. I told him he should have thought about that before breaking in and changing the locks. Said I wasn't signing anything that helped him keep what he stole. The foundation report arrived a week later. The specialist had done a full inspection after I scheduled it. Sent copies to both me and Paul. The cracks had gotten worse over the winter. Immediate repair was critical to prevent total structural failure. Cost estimate was now over $100,000, up from the $60,000 Grandma had been quoted. Paul called me that night sounding scared instead of angry. Asked if Grandma knew about the foundation problems. I told him yes. She'd been monitoring them for 3 years. Said she planned to fix everything this spring before she got sick. He asked why she didn't do it sooner, and I explained she was saving up the money because she didn't want to take out another loan. He got quiet for a long time, then asked if I'd help pay for the repairs. I laughed and hung up. The electrical situation got worse fast. Paul had been running space heaters after I canceled the gas service. The old 1962 panel couldn't handle the load. An electrical inspector showed up after neighbors reported burning smells, condemned the panel as an immediate fire hazard. Now Paul faced a mandatory $30,000 rewiring job before the city would let anyone live there. The inspector red-tagged the house. Paul had to move out immediately. I drove by that evening and saw him loading boxes into his car. He was staying at some cheap motel off the highway, burning through what little savings he had on the room, the utility deposits, all the contractor estimates piling up. I didn't feel bad for him at all. Frances Livingston from the Historic District Office showed up next. Neighbors had reported construction noise, and she came for a surprise inspection. Found Paul's demolished kitchen with the original 1920s tiles smashed up and sitting in garbage bags. Those tiles were irreplaceable. Grandma had loved that kitchen. Frances issued a stop work order right there. $500 in daily fines until Paul restored everything to period-appropriate condition. The materials alone would cost $20,000, assuming he could even find authentic tiles from that era. Paul called me crying about the fines. Said he was just trying to update the kitchen to make the house more sellable. I told him he should have gotten permits first. Said ignorance wasn't an excuse when you were destroying historic property. The burst pipes happened during a cold snap. I'd canceled the power weeks ago and Paul couldn't afford to get it turned back on after the deposit. The house had no heat. The copper pipes froze solid, then burst when temperatures rose. 3 feet of water flooded the basement before Paul even noticed. He'd been at the motel and only checked on the house every few days. By the time he found it, Grandma's stored furniture was ruined. Her photo albums destroyed. All those pictures from when I was little, from when my parents were alive. The water sat for almost a week, creating this massive mold problem. Another $20,000 to fix. I drove by and saw the water stains on the basement windows. Stood there on the sidewalk staring at them. My anger at Paul mixed with grief over losing Grandma's things. Those photos could never be replaced. Paul's lawyer finally sent a letter to Hattie. Threatened to sue me for property damage and interference. Said I was deliberately sabotaging the house to hurt Paul. Hattie's response was beautiful. She wrote this detailed breakdown of everything I'd done. Explained how canceling utilities was my legal right as power of attorney and joint account holder. How scheduling contractor estimates was basic property management. How every single action was completely legal. Then she copied the mortgage company, the city, and the insurance adjuster. Made sure everyone knew Paul was the illegal occupant, not me. That he had no legal standing to be in that house at all. Paul's lawyer stopped returning his calls after that. The mortgage company's foreclosure letter arrived 3 days later. 2 weeks to pay the full $300,000, or they'd start eviction proceedings. I got a copy since I was still listed as power of attorney on all the estate documents. Paul didn't know the mortgage company had my contact information too. The letter detailed every problem with the property. Water damage, electrical hazards, no insurance, unpaid city fines. They'd done their homework. The property was considered high risk, and they wanted their money immediately. Paul called at 2 in the morning. I could hear him crying before he even spoke. His words came out slurred and broken. He said I was destroying Grandma's legacy, that she'd be ashamed of what I was doing to her house and her son. I stayed quiet and let him talk. He went on about how Grandma would hate seeing family fight like this, how she always wanted us to get along. When he finally stopped to breathe, I told him Grandma would hate what he did more. Stealing from family, breaking into her house the day of her funeral, changing the locks on the granddaughter she actually loved. Then I blocked his number. I didn't need to hear his drunk excuses anymore. The city fines kept climbing. Frances called me to give me updates even though I wasn't the legal occupant. She knew the situation from Hattie and wanted to make sure I understood how bad things were getting. 24 days since the stop work order and Paul hadn't done anything to fix the kitchen. The fines were at $12,000 now. Frances filed a lien against the property. That meant even if Paul somehow sold the house, the city would get paid before he saw a single dollar. She sent me a copy of the lien paperwork. It felt good seeing it in writing. Hattie sent Paul a letter the same day. She itemized every single cost he was facing. $300,000 for the reverse mortgage, $60,000 for foundation repairs, $30,000 for electrical rewiring, $20,000 for mold remediation, $12,000 in city fines and climbing, plus his ongoing motel bills, utility deposits he'd already paid, and contractor estimates he'd requested. The letter was 3 pages long. Each line showed another financial disaster Paul had walked into. Hattie ended by noting that as the illegal occupant, he was personally responsible for all of it. The house couldn't be sold without clear title, which he didn't have. He couldn't get insurance without proving ownership, which he couldn't do. He was trapped. My phone rang 2 days later. Unknown number. I answered and heard Lisa's voice for the first time since the funeral. She didn't even say hello, just started screaming. Called me a vindictive monster who was destroying her brother over a house. Said I should be ashamed of weaponizing Grandma's trust in me, using the power of attorney to hurt family. I waited until she took a breath, then told her Paul literally broke into the house and stole it. He changed the locks while everyone was at the funeral reception. He refused to leave when the will clearly stated the house was mine. Lisa didn't care about any of that. She said he was family and I was being cruel by not just sharing it. We could sell the house and split the money. Why did I have to make everything so difficult? That's when I understood. She'd always seen me as less than her blood relatives. Didn't matter that Grandma raised me for 10 years. Didn't matter that I was there every Sunday while Lisa called twice a year. In her mind, I was just the granddaughter. Paul was her brother. Real family. Blood family. I told her if she cared so much about Paul, she could pay his bills. Then I hung up. Paul tried to list the house for sale the next week. I found out when a real estate agent called me asking about the property. She'd done a title search and found the will situation. Asked if I was aware someone was trying to sell a house I legally owned. I told her the whole story. She apologized for bothering me and said she'd already told Paul she couldn't help him. No agent would touch a property without clear title. It was too risky. Could open them up to lawsuits. Hattie heard about it through her network and immediately filed a cease and desist order. Sent it to every real estate office in the county. Made it clear that any attempt to sell the property would result in legal action. Paul's lawyer stopped returning his calls after that. Even his own attorney knew the case was hopeless. Paul had no legal standing. No way to prove ownership. No way to sell. No way to get insurance. No way to stop the bleeding. The motel manager called me on a Thursday afternoon. Nice woman named Carol. She said Paul was 3 days behind on his bill and his credit cards were maxed out. She'd tried calling him, but he wasn't answering. Asked if I'd be willing to pay his balance so she didn't have to evict him. I told her I wasn't responsible for Paul's debts. He was a grown man who made his own choices. Carol sighed and said she understood, but she'd have to kick him out tomorrow morning if he didn't pay. I thanked her for calling and hung up. Part of me felt bad. Paul was about to be homeless while claiming to own an $800,000 house. But he'd brought all of this on himself. Every single bit of it. Paul showed up at my apartment at 6 the next morning. I heard pounding on my door and looked through the peephole. He looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes. Unshaven. Clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. I opened the door and he practically fell inside. Started begging immediately. Said he couldn't handle the financial pressure anymore. The city was threatening to arrest him for the unpaid fines. The mortgage company was starting foreclosure. He had nowhere to live. His credit was destroyed. He needed me to take the house back. I crossed my arms and looked at him. Told him my offer still stood. Sign a confession acknowledging he stole the house. Pay me $50,000 for damages and legal fees. Then I'd take over the property and all its problems. Otherwise, he could figure it out himself. Paul argued he didn't have $50,000. Asked if I'd accept $20,000 instead. I shook my head. Told him the number would actually go up by $5,000 every week he delayed. My legal fees kept growing. Hattie was billing me for all the work she was doing. The longer this dragged on, the more it would cost him. Paul's face went pale. He asked where he was supposed to get that kind of money. I suggested he ask Lisa since she was so concerned about family helping each other. He left without another word. Lisa called me that evening. Her voice was cold and controlled. Said she'd loan Paul $30,000 if I reduced my demand. I told her no. Told her Paul needed to face real consequences for what he did. She argued with me for 20 minutes, but I held firm. Finally, she said she'd talk to Hattie directly. I gave her Hattie's number and hung up. Hattie called me an hour later. Said Lisa was willing to go up to $45,000 if Paul signed the confession and a promissory note for the remaining $5,000 payable over 12 months. I didn't want to accept. Wanted Paul to pay the full amount. But Hattie reminded me that getting $45,000 now was better than fighting for months and maybe getting nothing. I agreed, but made it clear I wanted this finished. We met at Hattie's office on Monday morning. Paul sat across from me looking defeated. Lisa sat next to him glaring at me like I was the villain in all this. Hattie had the papers ready. A confession statement where Paul admitted he illegally occupied the house I inherited and changed the locks without authority. A promissory note for $45,000 from Lisa. A payment plan for the remaining $5,000 over 12 months. Paul signed everything without looking at me once. His hands shook as he wrote his name. Lisa wrote a check for $45,000 and slid it across the table. She stared at me the whole time with pure hatred in her eyes. I felt nothing except exhaustion. Just wanted this nightmare to end. I took the house keys from Paul and drove straight to Grandma's house. First time I'd been inside in 6 weeks. The front door stuck when I tried to open it. Inside smelled like mold and something else I couldn't identify. Desperation, maybe. The living room looked mostly okay, but the kitchen was destroyed. Paul had ripped out half the cabinets and left them in pieces on the floor. The original tiles Grandma loved were smashed and thrown in garbage bags. I walked down to the basement and saw the water damage. Brown stains on the walls, warped floorboards, Grandma's furniture ruined. I found some of her photo albums in a soggy pile. The pictures were destroyed. All those memories from when I was little, from when my parents were alive, gone. I went back upstairs and sat in Grandma's favorite chair in the living room, the one she'd sit in every Sunday when I came for dinner. I sat there and cried for everything that was lost. Not just the physical damage to the house, but the family relationships that would never be repaired, the trust that was broken, the grandmother who wasn't here to see any of this. I cried until I had nothing left. I drove back to Grandma's house the next day with Hattie to start the insurance paperwork. She brought her laptop and a thick folder of forms that needed my signature as the legal owner. We sat at the kitchen table, or what was left of it, and she walked me through each claim. Water damage to the basement, mold growing on the foundation walls, structural damage from the burst pipes, the destroyed photo albums and furniture. Each item felt like another piece of Grandma disappearing. Hattie kept her voice calm and professional while I signed page after page. She took photos of everything with her phone. The watermarks on the basement ceiling, the ripped-out cabinets Paul had left in garbage bags, the original tiles he'd smashed and thrown away. She measured the damaged areas and wrote notes about when each problem started. The insurance company needed proof that Paul's occupation caused the damage, not normal wear and tear. I showed her the utility cancellation dates and the timeline of when the pipes burst. She nodded and added it all to her documentation. Victor from the insurance company showed up 2 hours later to do his own inspection. He was older, maybe 60, with reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. He walked through every room taking more photos and asking questions about what Grandma had maintained versus what Paul destroyed. I explained how Grandma monitored the foundation cracks but planned to fix them this spring. How she knew the electrical panel needed updating but was saving money for it. How the pipes were fine until Paul let the house freeze without power. Victor listened and took notes. He spent 20 minutes in the basement examining the water damage and mold. When he came back upstairs, he told me the claim would be approved for $35,000. The water damage and mold were clearly caused by Paul's negligence during his illegal occupation. I felt relief for the first time in weeks. $35,000 would cover most of the immediate repairs. But Hattie reminded me the foundation and electrical work would cost another $40,000 at least. Money I'd have to pay from my own savings. I'd been putting aside money for years, planning to buy my own house someday. Now it would all go into fixing Grandma's house instead. The contractors started showing up the following week. Foundation specialists first, because that was the most urgent. They jacked up sections of the house and poured new concrete to stabilize the cracks. The work was loud and invasive. Watching strangers tear into Grandma's house made my stomach hurt. But I stayed there every day, monitoring their progress and making sure they did everything right. The electrical rewiring took 3 weeks. They had to open walls and replace the ancient panel with modern breakers and proper wiring throughout the house. I found old newspapers from 1962 stuffed in the walls as insulation. Grandma had lived here when those were current news. The mold remediation team came next, wearing masks and protective suits. They sealed off the basement and ran huge fans and dehumidifiers for days. The smell slowly changed from musty decay to chemical cleaners. They replaced all the damaged drywall and treated everything with anti-mold solutions. I threw away most of Grandma's ruined furniture. The couch where she used to read, the coffee table I'd done homework on as a kid. All of it too damaged to save. Last came the kitchen reconstruction. This took the longest because I insisted on period-appropriate materials. I found a historic preservation supplier 3 hours away who sold authentic 1920s tiles and fixtures. Cost twice as much as modern replacements, but I didn't care. Grandma had loved that kitchen. I wasn't going to let Paul's destruction erase it completely. The contractor rebuilt the cabinets using photos I had from family dinners, matched the wood stain as close as possible, installed the vintage tiles in the same pattern Grandma had maintained for 50 years. 4 months after I took the house back, the last contractor finally left. I walked through every room checking their work. The house looked beautiful again. Better than it had in years, actually. All the deferred maintenance Grandma couldn't afford was finally fixed, but it had cost me everything in my savings account. $42,000 of my own money on top of the insurance payout. I was broke and exhausted. A thick envelope arrived from Lisa's lawyer 2 weeks later. I recognized the firm's name on the return address. Inside was a single-page letter on official letterhead. Lisa and Paul were cutting off all contact with me effective immediately. They considered me dead to the family for my cruel treatment of a grieving son. The letter used phrases like emotional abuse and vindictive behavior. Said I'd weaponized Grandma's trust to punish Paul for being the rightful heir. I read it twice, then filed it in the folder with all the other legal documents. Part of me wanted to be angry, to call Lisa and remind her that Paul literally broke into the house and stole it, that everything I did was protecting what Grandma left me. But mostly I just felt tired. I'd traded my entire extended family for this house. Paul and Lisa would never speak to me again. Their kids, my cousins, would grow up thinking I was the villain who destroyed their family. I sat in Grandma's living room wondering if she would think it was worth it. She'd always valued loyalty and truth over blood relations. Told me family was about who showed up, not who shared DNA. I'd shown up every Sunday for 10 years. Paul showed up when he needed money. Maybe she would understand why I fought so hard. Or maybe she would have wanted me to find a way that didn't burn every bridge. I'd never know. 6 months after Grandma died, I finally moved into the house, packed up my apartment and loaded everything into a rental truck. The house was legally mine now, with my name on the deed and all the utilities transferred. Every repair finished, every bill paid. I spent the first night in my childhood bedroom, the same room I'd slept in from age 8 to 18. The floorboards still creaked in the same spots. The window still stuck when you tried to open it. The closet door still didn't quite close all the way. I lay in bed listening to the house settle around me. All those familiar sounds I'd grown up with. Grandma's presence was everywhere. In the stained glass windows she'd cleaned every spring. In the hardwood floors she'd maintained so carefully. In the kitchen where we'd had Sunday dinners for years. I'd protected her legacy. Fought for what she wanted me to have. But the victory felt hollow. I'd spent months being calculating and cold. Weaponizing my knowledge against Paul. Watching him suffer and not feeling sorry about it. I'd won the house but lost myself a little in the process. I went out to the front porch where Grandma and I used to sit after dinner. The same wicker chairs were still there. I sat in her spot and looked out at the street. Decided that protecting what was mine had been worth the cost. Grandma raised me to stand up for myself and not let people take advantage. Paul tried to steal my inheritance and I stopped him. Maybe there was a better way that wouldn't have required destroying family relationships. Maybe I could have been less ruthless about it. But sitting here in the house she wanted me to have, I knew I'd do it all again. Some nights I still wondered if I'd become someone Grandma wouldn't recognize. Someone willing to hurt others to protect what was theirs. But then I remembered Paul answering the door in his bathrobe, telling me to schedule a time to get my personal items. Remembered him laughing when I first demanded he leave. He made his choice. I just made sure he paid for it.